Yeah, quick update from John Austin, and then I'll turn it over to John Cart.
There's a lot I could offer updates on, but I will refrain. But since our botanist Grace Glenn has joined us today, Commissioner Herrick made it possible for us this year to get some of our staff in the legislature to testify on a variety of topics. Grace had an opportunity to testify to the House Agriculture Committee on H-664, which was a bill designating the bear's head tooth mushroom as the state of Vermont mushroom.
Oh,
And they had a 3-hour block of time one morning to take testimony on the designation of a state mushroom.
wow.
I thought going into that, there's no way this committee is going to spend 3 hours hearing and geeking out about fungi. They were on the edge of their seat. And they had a cast of people who were either expert in or passionate about mushrooms and fungi offering testimony, but Grace knocked it out of the park. I mean, just an excellent representative for all of our collective interests about everything ecological, and did a wonderful job of connecting the significant role of fungi to Grace used the examples of all of these rare orchids that rely on an association with various types of psyllium. Just enthralled, and wants her to come back and speak to the other issues of interest to them.
Okay, way to go, Grace. Very
Really
nice.
exciting. We had Bree Furphy, who's our fur bear project leader, testify to the Senate Agriculture Committee on their concerns regarding the presence of certain types of rodenticides in various types of wildlife. In particular, she was testifying on the presence of rodenticides in fisher and bobcat. And we know this because Kim Royer years ago took it upon herself to start to collect tissue samples from bobcat and fisher that were harvested by regulated trappers. And we've discovered that, you know, it's prevalent in those species, and we don't know that it's an issue or that it's a problem for the survival of those species, but we know that it's present, and we should be mindful of it. So anyway, Bree Furphy had an opportunity to testify there, which was great. Will Dwayne, who's our land conservation specialist, he does all of our real estate work, and there's a lot of it. That could be a whole conversation with this group in and of itself. There's so much work going on there. He represents us in the State House every year when the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board has their annual Conservation Day in the legislature. That's when the HCB and lots of partners who do land conservation work and housing project work go in and testify in support of the HCB and the need for VHCB funding. So, you know, Will is always a regular presence in that day, and that's an opportunity for him to share some of the cool work that we're doing in partnership with lots of other organizations for land conservation. And I guess the last thing I'll share with you is Will Dwayne and Alyssa Bennett and Amy Alfieri have applied for another recovery land acquisition grant. These are it's a federal grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The funds are specifically for acquiring land that will benefit the conservation of federally listed threatened or endangered species. We've used RLAG funds for a variety of projects over the years, including Turner Hill Wildlife Management Area. That was created through the use of RLAG funds because the wetlands on that property support the federally endangered northeastern bulrush. But we've used the funds also for the conservation of land to benefit Indiana bats and now northern long-eared bats, both of which are on the federal list. So they've applied for a grant to conserve some more land around Snake Mountain in Addison County. So this would be an add-on to actually ultimately maybe a connection between Snake Mountain Wildlife Management Area and the Lemon Fair Wildlife Management Area. And so this property that we've applied for a grant for is all forested on the south end of what's that? It's actually not on Snake Mountain, but it's within that larger forest block that Snake Mountain is a part of. So it would actually join, if you're familiar with the Nature Conservancy owned property in that area, this would be an addition to that.
Deering land? Deering.
And we've acquired most of the Deering farm at this point. This is actually the last piece of the Deering farm that is available. The Deerings have been great to work with. They've been very conservation minded. They've retired from farming and they wanted to see the land conserved. Much of the land is lowland along the Lemon Fair River. It's a tributary to Otter Creek. And so we've been gradually expanding our ownership footprint along the Lemon Fair for 15, 20 years. And have made substantial progress in the last 10 years with funds from EPA, where we've been doing farm buyouts in the floodplain, and then doing a bunch of wetland restoration work. In fact, we just closed a week or two ago on it's called the Gorton property, and it's along the Lemon Fair. You're probably familiar with it, Jim. That one is prime for grassland bird nesting habitat, and so we're looking at hopefully or developing a plan that will enhance the habitat for grassland birds on that property.
But this RLAG thing is just for this Snake Mountain to Lemon Fair, or this is different from the secretary mentioned. Mother grant, the $10 million,
That's a different
thing.
thing.
I guess, John, what I might say, I'm wondering, as opposed to having Will come here, I mean, I don't know how much of rounds he'd like to make, but I'm wondering about the SAGs inviting John to their meetings, just kind of thinking about, I mean, that's sort of where the taxa level expertise is in terms of thinking about what might be key areas that could need protection. It seems like that could be, really helpful.
That's a good idea, Helen.
Bag chairs, you got that? Action item.
Well, Wayne,
I've actually been really interested in having that kind of input sort of baked into the process of land acquisition prioritization. The reality is that a lot of it is very opportunistic, and
That's what I was
but-
gonna ask, is how much do you actually get to sort of
right.
guide the process towards a goal versus
Right.
respond?
But there's always room to at least know what the priorities are,
Mhm.
and then if opportunities arise that match, then you have those set
Yeah.
to go.
Mhm.
But yeah, I agree. I think that's a great idea.
well, and timely, it occurs to me. So you got Act 59, which is in play right now, the 30 by 30, 50 by 50 law.
Yeah.
Biodiversity conservation law, and that's all about land conservation. So over the next year and a half, the agency, Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, and then lots of partners will be working on developing a plan to guide land conservation to achieve those goals. And that would be a really great opportunity to bring into the conversation the interests of this committee and the SAG.
For sure.
One of the things we've never done, it's a herb sag, and probably none of the rest of the groups have done, is really just kind of come up with a map, prioritized herb areas. Where the primary conservation parcels would be that would do the most good for the most species of herbs. Now, we don't really have I ask people to do that, but it would be valuable at some point. I could see each of these groups coming up with their priority conservation areas, whether it be a pond or a stream or
So that's a well-timed comment because Bob Zano's coming in to talk about Vermont Conservation Design,
Yeah.
which is designed to have the coarse filter of landscape priorities, but then also use fine filter. And so when he was talking to me about presenting here, I said, I'll bet people are going to want to see like how it fits in with species distributions. And so I think that would be great to talk about in a little bit.
Okay.
Not to shut you down, just
It's just something we've never done, and I would see it as valuable, and
yeah.
that it could work hand in hand with 30 by 30, 50 by 50. And most of our species really are fine filter species.
Mhm.
you know, where you have to really look at the specific needs of those
Yep.
species.
Yep.
Yeah.
You don't want to just buy the town of Addison, Jim?
This is kind of done with us buying.
For Florida, I guess we've sort of benefited in this regard from work the Native Plant Trust has done in concert with the Nature Conservancy with their IPAs or important plant areas, sort of a spin-off on the important bird area concept.
Mhm.
And that's a region-wide analysis of a number of their areas or throughout the state. Can serve as some kind of guiding framework.
I think you need to like sponsor the idea of a new craft beer.
We do, really. That's why they chose that acronym.
IHA, important urban areas.
Yeah, I guess there is what the native, there's the native hops.
There are rare hops.
We don't, well, there's,
Rare hop.
there, yeah, it's like whether or not it's really a native, yeah. They're very hard to distinguish and so we don't have very good information.
I'm more curious.
It's, you
know, we have butterflies that. Old name for one of the Polygonia.
Oh,
Yeah, Sean Austin would
Yeah, I
be
think it's a hop species.
into this, I think.
Gray comma or something.
Well, I think it's a great idea for plants too. And I talked to Will Dwayne about like, what if we had a short list of actual
Cool.
parcels and our priorities? Like, we now have a new federally listed species, a small world begonia. So there's a potential to get our land funding for that species. And I've been looking at all the surrounding parcels and trying to get interested landowners. Nobody has bitten yet, but it'd be great. They have a lot of funds available and it encouraged us to pursue that. So
yeah,
it's exciting.
we should talk about this more for SAG work.
Yeah.
Okay, we should get rolling here. Only 20 minutes behind here, so. John, take it away. I've got John's report, which is in our shared drive, the endangered species permitting summary. John, I'm up here and can drive however you'd like me to, wherever you'd like me to go.
I don't know, why don't you just jump to page 3 for now, and I'll try and do this pretty quickly. It was a busier year than most, it seemed, for permits. A total of 39 endangered species permits were applied for, either new, amended, or renewed. But I think the reason they felt, well, that was more than the previous couple of years. I think the reason it felt pretty busy was a few of them really pulled in a lot of, required a lot of attention. Even putting aside the whole bit at the airport. In part, there were a couple projects that were looking at Fowler's toad, which a species we hadn't had much experience before, so we're having to develop what sort of permit conditions, what impacts might there be, and what conditions might be needed to help monitor and or minimize and mitigate problems. There was that, a spotted turtle project, a few plants, and we made it through another related permit, only to find at the last minute they found another endangered plant on the site and had to kind of revisit that. So there's a lot of having to do some new thinking rather than applying like, here's the standard protocols we've used in the past, and we're gonna slap them on this new permit. So the HerbSAG in particular did a heck of a lot of work in feeding us good information, or at least and feedback and helping us rethink some of the think through some of these steps. Overall, I guess the other bigger chunk it's a wave of every few years. Hydro facilities have to be re-permitted at the federal level, and when they do that, there's They, it's under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or FERC, FERC relicensing. There's a number of, studies usually done. In this case, there were several for, mussels. So one of the reasons there were so many permits this last year was there were a number of mussel surveys that had to be done at these sites. And most of them turned up no mussels, because they're downstream of dams. And the dams and or long-term history have had an effect on the mussels there. But a few places there were still some mussels found, rare endangered mussels were found, which was nice to find. Some of those reports are still coming in, still waiting on those. But I guess, again, I'll ask this question. I don't know if any of you had a chance to look at this report. Is this the sort of information you want? Is there a better way to feed it to you? Do you have questions on any one in particular? Or any three in particular?
I'll just bring up one right now, John. I mean, when you're talking about, finding some rare endangered mussels, I mean, those are, essentially, unless there's going to be some unusual release or something like that, there wouldn't be a permit associated with it. This is just in terms of assessing like structural integrity of the dam, or how does ESC come into play with something like that?
So as they're doing they're preparing reports to submit for, like, can the dam get relicensed? They have to say, what species might be affected. It's everything from, fish that might be affected by warmer waters. They're required to do a mussel survey, so to go in, they have to actually handle the mussels. So we issue a permit for a survey.
Okay.
And then usually that's just that we get some data on where the mussels are.
Mm-hmm.
In situations where it's, say, V-Trans is replacing a bridge, or Montpelier is doing some bank stabilization along the river where there was some flood damage, they first have to do a survey, and then before they would do some construction of it, if there were enough mussels there, they'd have to come back to us with a plan for where they're going to move the mussels, how we're going to monitor those mussels over the coming year. And we've got a fairly well-established process for that. And so a bunch of years ago, the Endangered Species Committee said, as long as everything follows that protocol, do the survey. If there's more than 10 mussels found, then you have to, before you can do construction, you have to come back to us with a management plan. The management plan meets those goals, the required goals. They can do the movement, the monitor the mussels for the year, do the construction, and then report back to us. And so that sort of happens without, we call that, those are permits that are approved as a class by this group. And I've sort of flagged a bunch of those, but that's the usual process for mussel surveys. It's been a while since we've had something like that doesn't fit that model that was required to come to you and ask you to make a call in advance.
What is it? I guess for these dam relicensing projects, how does it work for other listed species in terms of if there's sometimes there's changes in the dam operation and flows, sometimes not with the relicensing. Are those coming to us eventually if there are other listed species that
Yes.
there's the whole FERC process, but then there's our permit as well.
Yes.
We haven't seen any of those come through while I've been on the
Correct.
committee, I guess.
Yeah. If there were other listed species, it would come here. It also goes through, DEC has people looking at it, and for many years, our department had a person based in the fisheries division that was looking really mostly at, sport fish and other fish, and just they're not endangered or threatened generally, but just what are the impacts of those dams on the fish, and how is water processed, so there are a variety of layers in which Fish and Wildlife Department and ANR have some oversight. But I can't recall a time when a different endangered species might have come up. That said, there was also last year, the dam, like, you want to say Curtis, what town?
Curtis Pond.
Curtis Pond, yeah,
Callis.
Curtis Pond Dam. They had, it's not, dam, it wasn't relicensed, it's not a hydro dam, it's just a dam. There's endangered plant found there, and that came to you guys for
Mhm.
review.
Yeah, I was thinking more just in terms of the interplay between the FERC process and our process,
Yeah,
timeframes and how it.
yeah, generally the FERC process is several years long, and hopefully everything sort of makes it out to the various entities that are supposed to provide oversight within, well in advance of the work being done.
And DEC also looks at, as John mentioned, looks at impacts of fish on fish and macrovertebrates and mussels. But does not necessarily focus on rare species. It focuses on the community impact, which is already there. I mean, you put a dam up on a river, I mean, it changes everything upstream. And if the regulation of the flow is extreme enough, it can impact downstream as well. So DEC is continuing to, as far as I know, look at all sorts of communities below, not only rare ones.
I've been involved from a plant perspective in the development of some of these FERC relicensing studies, the field work and then the reporting. And they essentially look at everything upstream and downstream that could or would be impacted if the operation of that dam changed. So for run of river, which is a lot of the smaller hydro facilities, sort of that area of potential effect gets defined, and it's a full survey of, full inventory, at least for veg. And for under the way that the FERC process works, they're looking not only at listed, but also rare species. So all that data gets kind of churned through that process. And it's slow, you're right.
A side note, this got me wondering about another person who could come in and talk about a regulatory work would be Noel Dodge to speak to. You end up seeing the permits at the end, and as SAG groups helping to develop those conditions, that's a subset of the number of projects that have potential impacts that we have to go through some sort of review of internally. And I'm just looking at graphs that Noel produced for me, and they've just skyrocketed. I wonder if that wouldn't also be something to throw into one of these meetings at some point, is sort of that overview of what we see or what we are seeing, what the trends are, and this increase that John's talking about, why that is. And John threw out some ideas, but also it's just things like housing developments and infrastructure, and just to give more context. And the other important piece to always remember is that there's a lot of habitat being protected. It's not just lost, like with the 2-1 mitigation. So he has a nice graph of showing impacts versus protected in each year. So that's always encouraging, because we feel like we're always kind of negotiating, but actually there's protection happening in the end. So I don't know if that would be of interest to this group to really understand sort of more than nuts and bolts of what we see inside the department before you even get to have a look at it.
What it's worth, I think that's a great idea, because there's so many nuances to that, to all of the processes that we participate in, that a lot of people don't get to appreciate. And there's also a lot of intangible benefits from our participation in all of these processes that often go sort of unnoticed. So, the number of acres protected versus lost is the obvious one, but there's so many other benefits to people's participation in those processes, not the least of which is just raising the awareness and appreciation on the part of the regulated community about rare and irreplaceable natural areas and rare plants and the interaction amongst species and habitats and communities. And and working with the consulting community, for instance, and how those relationships provide intangible benefits. It's, yeah, I think that would be great. I would imagine that this committee would be interested in learning more about that. Noel would be a good person to do it. I agree.
I would say, parallel to the endangered species permitting process, there's the work, Noel and others lead for us, but under Act 250, that hopefully, for development, and under Section 248 for energy development, where hopefully, if that part goes well, we avoid the need to come to you guys with the endangered species impacts, because they've designed the project in a way that avoids that. But, then there are times they just butt heads. So, but yeah, Noel can talk with that. I guess the only other piece I'll say coming in this somewhat near future, VTrans is restarting its work or planning on Route 78 upgrades, which will affect probably some listed birds, herbs, invertebrates, and plants. And we've been talking with them for at least a year or so now, trying to get them to get things in order and to do endangered species permitting applications early. I don't know where that is right now, but it's going to hit a bunch of the various SAGs and this committee at some point.
Appreciate you bringing that up, John. We actually had the commissioner send a letter to VTrans recently, putting them on notice that, and advising them, please deal with the T&E species takings permits before you go to any other permit process. We don't want the creation of any sort of unrealistic expectations. And there, as John says, there's some serious issues to work out with that project.
Where are they? Where on 78? I mean, a big part of it, or 78?
Basically,
like
you remember where the old refuge building is?
Yeah, all over there. Yeah.
Basically starts there and goes all the way to the bridge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
V-Trans.
That project has been in the works. It was one of the first projects that I started my career with this department.
I knew you were gonna say that.
That was 30 years.
Yeah.
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 But now it looks like it's
Oh.
really gaining steam.
Black tern list is black
Yes,
tern.
that's one of That's the bird.
Yeah.
Yeah, and fish too, turtle.
Yeah.
But turtles, birds, herbs, fish,
Yeah.
plants.
Yeah.
And
Like
it's-
the stew of rare species.
Special place.
It's actually one of those big projects, big lifts that Andy Wood has been coordinating.
Yeah, it's been great.
And he was a position that was added for ARPA projects, but that funding is ending
Okay.
at the end of this year, and we lose that position.
Right.
So that's gonna, we're trying to make something work out, but just a heads up. He coordinates a whole bunch of regulatory projects that come through, and he and Noel work together, and they are beyond full up. We're gonna lose one position of the two
When?
at the end of the fiscal year,
At the end of the-
calendar year, I mean.
Okay.
And we're scrambling to try to find a solution to that, but.
Well, I mean, I think this is really helpful, John. And it's also, I mean, it's kind of like you can sort of see the year in review as well in terms of, just thinking back to the good times we've had. So I really appreciate it. I think one question that I have, and maybe it makes sense to spread it out, but I guess I would ask the question, does it make sense to do John's report at the same time we do all the SAG report annual review? Should it just be sort of annual report day and have you present this in January? I don't know what other folks think about that.
Whatever's easiest
Do you
for you
care?
is fine with me.
It makes a lot of sense. Might
Yeah.
depend on
Yeah, yeah, okay, all
how
right,
much capacity we need in that meeting
Yeah.
for
Yeah. Yeah.
other permits.
Does that work for you?
Sure.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
guys, anytime.
yeah.
Where do you have the most space in the agendas that you put together? I mean,
You never know.
Yeah.
You really never know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that would, that would cut back the January agenda a little bit. And that one's always fairly packed just because of the SAG reports, but, yeah, I think we'll be okay. Yeah,
Bag reports generally can take the most time because
Right.
a lot of questions get asked.
yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and I think, bringing in Noel and it might be interesting to sort of ask the question, is that something we would like to see regular updates on in terms of sort of the the work that's been doing in 250 and 248? Or is that sort of a one-time and maybe, in a few years we could invite Noel back?
What does the role actually do? I'm sort of missing the role of his, what's his role?
Oh, boy. John, you'll speak to that best.
Well, Noel is one of several biologists in the wildlife division, and the same is true for the fisheries division. For reviewing Act 250 permits, Public Utility Commission permit applications, wetland permit applications, Army Corps engineer, any sort of land or water use regulations where permits are involved and our agency has a role in reviewing them for effects on, in our case, fish and wildlife and habitats. We have folks assigned to do that. Some of them spend more time than others. Noel's primary responsibility is to sort of oversee and coordinate all of that work statewide. So he has.
Maybe making sure that these projects don't get to our table.
That's part of the role,
Okay,
yeah.
so that's why we don't ever see Noel. Okay.
That's one of those
Let me do it.
intangibles, right? It's,
Yeah, okay,
the ideal is to make sure nothing gets impacted in the first place.
got it. But, yeah, so that would be helpful, I think, to really understand, all the stuff that's happening that you have to deal with.
That would be great to get more airtime with that work, because it's
Yeah,
some of our frontline work that, doesn't often get a lot of attention.
yeah, no, that would be really, because otherwise we're kind of, personally, I'm, working from a vacuum here or in a vacuum because I'm not part of the broader, scientific community or whatever within the state. I don't really know what's going on those other levels. So.
I assume in the effort to not have things get to this committee, Noel's primarily tapping all the other biologists and botanists and everyone within the department. I think probably other SAG chairs would feel this way too, but it's certainly welcome to reach out to SAGs as well, if that's helpful for capacity reasons.
I appreciate
So-
that, and that could be a helpful conversation to have. It's like, that would be a conversation on the heels of Noel giving you a presentation about the nuances and the ins and outs of how our involvement in these processes work. Because I think sometimes there's a hesitancy to take something to the SAG for advice and guidance because of the uncertainty of what might happen with the project from the beginning. And to your point, Matt, about, people like Noel or Andy are bringing in other experts in the department and from elsewhere. Grace is a good example of that. Grace spends a fair bit of her time with protecting rare and listed plants in these processes. So when something comes up flagged by Noel or Andy or somebody else, and it has a rare plant, in comes Grace or Bob Zana with Natural Communities, or Mark Ferguson with invertebrates or herps and that sort of thing.
I think a lot of things would fall through the cracks without Andy and Noel, that I just can't say enough about how important they are to me, to my job, because they're like a filter between all the projects that are going on in the state and me. They make it easier for me to filter out things that are probably not as important to review. Yeah.
to me, I think that most of what we do in this group and in the SEGs is reactive. Anything that we can do that is proactive, I think any of us would appreciate an opportunity to be involved proactively and provide information that can help prevent the need for all these permits. Because essentially that's what we do. We react to a permit that's put on our plate. And I've said here a number of times before that I think like periodically just sending out an endangered species reminder up to the secretary that these are the driving forces that are resulting in the need to list the species that we are listing. And this is what's going on, and anything we can do to address these issues will help limit the number of species that needs to be listed in the future. So I guess my comment is anything more that we can do proactively, I'd love to see it.
Here, here.
Thing that we've been digging around on the floor SAG, thinking about annual reports and seeing this information from John is super helpful. And I'm just wondering if there's parallel universe here. So we were talking in SAG about, we review and give great discussion and contemplation for permit applications and then make recommendations to the ESC for the conditions of those permits. And then like once the thing is issued, permittees are 9 times out of 10 or 10 times out of 10, required to conduct some kind of monitoring after that take occurs and report that back to Fish and Wildlife. But like we don't see that, we don't know about it. We blindly assume it's happening and have full faith that, Grace receives report or, whoever. But something we've been talking about in FLAG is, wouldn't it be neat if FLAG members had access to those monitoring reports or some aggregation of data? It's certainly not wanting to put more work on anyone's plate aggregating said data, but, I wonder, like, at the ESC level, if folks have wondered about that, like, we advise on the issuance of the permit, but then sort of, how does it all go?
What do we learn from the results?
Yeah, that's a great point.
We used to get reports like Bob would often present, results long-term about,
Transplants,
mitigation,
yeah.
situations and how things are actually working out. Going back to a site, 3 or 4 years later and counting the number of whatever species it was within a particular mitigation site and reporting back to us about that. And a lot of times it was kind of discouraging because, things would change and the habitat would change and, it was difficult to manage the sites because they were really the responsibility of somebody else. But he would back and look and so, yeah, it's helpful, but it was also kind of discouraging.
I'm wondering whether, like John, for example, in your matrix, whether like if there are checkboxes somewhere that like, yeah, they completed this requirement or not necessarily how they accomplished some condition, but whether they submitted a report, whether there's a way to track it and flag it so that we could say, hey, wait a minute, they never reported back on it. Like when I get a permit, I need to often supply a list or tell them what I found, and they, if I don't do it, I usually hear from the feds. So
Yeah, I can sort of add that to that and put the reports in the Endangered Species Committee's, SharePoint space and so that it's associated with each permit. To the extent we get them, yeah. Sometimes having people for reports is, unfortunately, I don't get enough time to do that.
yeah,
We don't do that for the man on time. But yeah,
yeah.
most of them do come in and I can make that make it clearer where they're available. And if to the extent where it's easy enough to say, all right, here's the result, maybe I can plug that into this piece too.
Or do you think it's, there may be a system for tracking whether they report it?
Yeah.
You know, like a compliance provision. I don't know whether that's feasible or.
It's mostly feasible. The hardest, generally, the reports come in, folks that we work with regularly know I'm not gonna even open their next application until we have all previous reports. The piece where we, particularly on research, where we say, and send us anything you publish.
Yeah.
We never know when that's gonna happen. And, it's usually several years later, we're far out of their mind by then. So,
Right.
so that piece, I don't have a great system for tracking down what happened. But the actual report required under a permit for, did you find the species? What happened to it?
That stuff.
Did you tag them? That sort of thing, that I can do.
How long can you continue to do that? I mean, some of these, agreements are for a set amount of time, right?
Correct. So beyond the permit term or the reporting requirement, we don't know.
Yeah.
But in your tracking, in your electronic tracking, your permit tracking system, there could be a field that says, okay, here's the date by which they need to send in their results or what they found or how much they collected,
Yeah, I have that. I sort of squeeze that out of this thing just to get it onto a manageable size piece of paper.
Okay.
Now that everything's digital, I guess I don't have to worry about how wide the spreadsheet is.
Well, I print everything. So, okay.
Your commitment to early successional habitat.
My share for the.
I do some of that and for the endangered species ones, I do try and, beginning of the year or so, send you a reminder.
Okay, yeah.
Habitats are important, but it doesn't, not that great at it.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And interestingly, I now with new technology, I work with a fair amount of people who just set up this email is going to go out on the day, or a week before the permit is, you could do it as you're issuing the permit. You could just set up your email to, send out I need this. And it'll go out a week before and another one the day of saying, state police are coming your way to bring you in and testify in front of the Endangered Species Committee. Okay, we should get going. Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is, if that conversation is concluded, I just I reached out to Dr. Haas about the captive cervid question. So I was going to answer it quickly.
Sure. Go for it.
So yes, the agency does do testing. They test testing of all susceptible species. Mortalities is required by statute and administrative rule. And then Dr. Haas goes into, if it's a captive cervid, except for fallow deer, they are tested. And the agency takes a number of methods in order to gain access to the farms, and because the animal has to be dead in order to do the testing. So they test mortalities. And so that I just wanted to respond to that. And I have more information, but I don't think it's necessary to share unless somebody's interested. Thanks.
What was the except fallow deer?
Yes, for us, that means all captive cervids except fallow deer are tested. The test candidates include those that die on the farm, are slaughtered on the farm, or are slaughtered at inspected or custom slaughter facilities. In all instances, the farmer is required to notify us in a timely manner of any on-farm mortalities. And our animal health staff go out and collect Obex and lymph node samples for testing. In the case of deer shipped to slaughter facilities, owners are required to acquire a movement permit from the agency for those shipments.
And then when they do, we coordinate with meat inspection staff to collect samples once the animal is slaughtered. All samples go to an out-of-state lab. Results are reported to us. If negative, they have always been. We release the carcass, so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering why fallow deer are an exception. That was just what I was wondering about.
I don't have an answer to that, but I
Okay.
can ask Dr. Haas. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, no worries. I was
I
just
think
kind of curious.
it's probably
yeah.
based on statute and rule, I would imagine.
Okay,
But
yeah,
I can clarify.
all right. Okay. Great. Well, we've got a couple of permits to go over. I think this first one is relatively straightforward. This is Bog Jacob's Ladder. You can see 2 to 3 leaves from 10 to 15 plants from 7 populations. This is we do have advice from the Flora SAG. They are suggesting a permit should be granted. They've got these conditions, visual survey, whether or not collection is sustainable. No sampling in sites with insufficient number of plants. They're suggesting that should be more than 100, no more than 3 leaves from each plant. 10 to 15 in each population, share the results. 7 populations visited for collection, clean gear, clean boots, etc. And you can see no concerns from the Flora SAG. And the applicant has worked with Grace in the application process. So I don't know, Matt, if you want to say anything more about it.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a research proposal coming from folks based down in Pennsylvania, where the species is also rare, and other collaborators, and and essentially we stand to learn about the genetics of this species at really no expense to ourselves and seemingly no impact to the population. Really, we're talking about gathering a couple of leaves off of a small number of individuals out of pretty large populations, many hundreds to thousands of plants, and they're talking about 10 to 15 plants. So it seems like essentially no impact and get some free data. So it seems like a good thing to us.
Yeah. Thoughts from the ESC?
This is not actually a bog species. This thing in. What's the community?
Calcareous swamps is where
Calcareous
I've seen it in other seeps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Motion to approve the permit with the SAG.
So moved.
conditions.
Second.
Any further comments, questions? All right, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions?
Stephanie
All right,
Smith. Thank you.
thank you, Stephanie. Yep. Okay, so that passes. John, I'll get you the official data before too long. And let's see, now I've got to do this in a faster manner here. So we've got one other permit. See how quickly I can get there.
Click your link off the agenda.
I'm
that
getting
was
there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that was one with Grace's.
Yeah.
Memo.
Okay. Let's see. There we go. Sorry, just too many buttons to click here. Okay. So this is a request from New England Botanical Society, Dr. Stanley. Any new or previously undocumented populations of the species on Vermont's list of endangered plants. And so this is about voucher specimens. And I don't know, Matt, I'll turn it over to you and you can say a little bit more.
Sure, yeah, and feel free to chime in, Grace. So, New England Botanical Society, formerly New England Botanical Club, well-respected botanical organization in New England. They lead a variety of different types of field trips for people interested in plants around New England. And Lisa, Dr. Stanley, was interested in doing more specimen collection on some of their trips in Vermont, and primarily focused on non-rare species. I should point out, this is more for incidental encounter of a rare species that they might want to also collect. The primary purpose being to essentially improve the sort of herbarium documentation, museum specimen documentation of species across the landscape, particularly in undercollected parts of the state, towns, and so forth. And so, knowing that they might potentially encounter rare species, wanted some kind of or a permit to enable that. And so Grace has worked with them to figure out. And we initially discussed sort of having this or rolling this into the collection permit that many of us on the FloraSag are under for documenting new rare species populations. And I guess we thought maybe it made a little bit more sense to have it as a separate permit, but that it seemed like a de minimis kind of action that probably could be handled, I guess, without our whole approval, but maybe I don't know exactly how that discussion played out, but at a first time round, maybe we need approval from this group, or yeah, I don't know. Between Grace and John, I don't know how that discussion worked out, but
I think if, we can issue the permit, however you guys see fit or not. But the voucher, collecting vouchers seems rather, it's a low impact, low threshold, but they don't come up much. So try our best to put it out in front of the committee to make a decision.
yeah, and with the conditions that were included in there, there's, I think, very parallel to what's on the collection permit that, again, any of us on the scientific advisory group have. So it's, to protect the populations and the collecting if there are enough present. And then also did provide for second specimen to be collected for the Pringle herbarium as well as the NEBC herbarium.
I think it's not super likely they're gonna end up collecting a bunch of listed
Yeah,
plants. It would be only if they find new undocumented populations.
Yeah.
They'd be able to collect a voucher specimen. It's sort of a just in case, just to cover them.
What is, I mean, is that a typo? The underlined 0 superscript? Collecting ramets and not, oh,
Gametes. You had like gametes that
Huh.
were
Yeah.
instead of genets.
genets.
Ah,
Yeah, genets. You have the word genet there.
Yeah,
Huh, I didn't notice that.
yeah, I don't know where that came from.
Very close reading.
Which I had to look up.
Yeah.
did I like mess that up somehow in my
It was in,
version? It was in the,
it was in the original.
okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah.
I mean, this should be what was uploaded. I don't think I
I
uploaded.
don't know if I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
It'll be in your evaluation, Ellen.
Yeah, I'll be kicked off the committee. John, I guess my question to you, John, where would this typically fall? If this came to you first, which permit type would this fall under for you?
I mean, I guess looking at back at our notes historically, we don't have anything that says like basic voucher collection is approved as a class by the
Yeah.
committee.
Okay.
So it just hadn't come up before.
Yeah, okay.
Because it had only been done sort of
Mhm.
within the Flora advisory group and our staff.
Mhm.
So now
Okay.
that's branching out.
Okay.
And I wasn't sure if the applicant needed to submit an application proper, so it would be good to just confirm if I get requests like this in the future. The committee would like to see an application or would like to review before John and I draft a permit.
Whatever, I think this is a great thing to have a precedent for, like, it's something that I would encounter collecting invertebrates, but I don't need to because we just don't have that many listed invertebrates.
Yeah,
But federally, like it is a thing.
Yeah.
So I think this is great. And I can see this is helping the invertebrate people as well.
Mhm.
A general permit like this.
Yeah.
And a simple application would be best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This would be reviewed, or reviewed every year, or this is a blanket permit, or this is once a year?
They tend to go every year, right?
So I think in this case, we just said it'd be
Just
1
a
year. If we issue them for multi-years, they'd be required to send a report in every year. And permits can only last for up to 5 years, so it wouldn't be open-ended.
It seems like if, I don't know. Think about it in terms of process, it seems like if there's a renewal process for this, like Lisa comes back next year, I wouldn't necessarily need to come to the
Yeah.
whole group, but yeah, I don't know. It's definitely
Yeah.
a little bit like, does it even need to come to the group in the first place?
Yeah.
Given that, you're working with Grace and,
Yeah.
they're a known entity. It's not like someone that no one has any idea who this is, just suddenly asking to collect a rare species.
but this would be also kind of another one that would be nice to say how many were, like have a report at the end of the year.
Right, and there is a reporting
Yeah,
requirement
yeah.
in there.
Yeah. Okay,
So if someone encountered a, plant that was never seen before in the state, and there's 3 individuals of it, are they gonna collect one of them?
20.
Well, if it had never been seen before in the state, it wouldn't be on our rare species list, so it would not actually, no permitting would apply, so they could take them all legally.
Well, it could be a species that hasn't been seen for.
For sure, historical or something like that.
Or if it's a new site.
Yeah, I think there's gotta be 20 or more stems
Yeah.
present
Stems.
to collect.
So they're
and,
gonna have,
And there's stipulations about, it's not watertight, but mainly only above ground collection unless there's some particular need to collect the roots,
Okay.
to make it more protective of the plants.
so like coral begonia would be safe, would be not be allowed to,
Right, unless there was a whole bunch of them and it was a new
Yeah.
population.
yeah,
There's a condition in our collecting permit that says a photo voucher shall be taken if
Yeah.
it's a really sensitive
Mhm.
orchid
Yeah.
or something
Yeah.
like that. for
Yeah,
orchids.
yeah,
Just take a photo.
Mhm.
Just, thinking about all those, damn botanists back in the day, just collecting randomly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Damn
certainly the
botanist.
collection activity is in a very different state.
The primates that.
There's not, really- I mean, it was a commercial endeavor at one point. I mean, that's what you're referring to. It's like botanists can collect this stuff and sell it essentially. It's not so much the case now. The financial incentive has been removed.
Okay, I guess, I mean, I guess what I would say is let's, I think we should just have, official formal approval here and I can send you, just on a regular advice form, so go for it. And, I don't know, I mean, to me, it feels like this is not something that's gonna come up that often, but anyway, yeah, we can just send it through the official process, so, yeah. Okay.
Great.
Motion to approve?
Yeah, I make a motion to approve the permit for. Yes, Whale Botanical Society voucher collections.
Second.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, Carla. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions, Stephanie?
Yes. Thank you.
All right, so motion passes and, John, I will get you paperwork shortly, so. All right, thanks, everyone. So Bob is here. Thanks for joining us, Bob. Great to have you. And, I don't know if you're in the meeting or if you've got anything you want to share online.
Yeah, I did want to put some slides up. I was thinking about like a short 15 minutes of presentation.
Yeah.
And then time for discussion, whatever you have in the schedule.
Yeah, no, sounds great. I think the meeting goes till like 4 or something like that, so.
Oh, it's allowed to leave the building.
Yeah,
So Bob, you can show slides and I'm recording.
I think we got a little more. Okay, all right. Well, I mean, we may be able to, the big thing is we've got another Lampricide permit after lunch, so
Right.
that's the kind of the primary one, so.
Do you need a?
Thanks, Grace.
Thanks all.
Yeah, you probably know how to do it. Yeah, bye, Grace.
So, yeah, so you're gonna hop on the meeting, right?
See ya.
Could you? Because,
This
the
thing
meeting's
is-
being recorded.
Yeah, this gets so confused.
How do you plug in? For or rank?
I think you just need to fix it
Join
to
the
invite to
meeting.
the meeting and then share. your screen.
This is like, I don't know,
That's
all bar was like 50 some odd species.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say, that doesn't look like anyone that I've seen. Yeah.
I forgot about the recording part.
Cool, with the rats are whitened at the base, that's
Oh, yeah.
that's beautiful. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess as we're getting ready, Bob's gonna share a screen and show a few slides. This is the segue that Jim called for into proactive conservation work.
Yeah.
So all our hopes and dreams will be. But thanks so much for coming. And this is, Bob's going to talk about some of the updates to Vermont conservation design. And I think sort of a little bit of some thoughts how the ESC and SAGs can kind of plug into the process.
He needs a minute to join the
Yeah.
meeting so he can share a slide, so he can get recorded.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess just in terms of like the rest of the agenda after Bob, I mean, we had a lunch break and then it was the Winooski Lampricide permit and then new business. So, I mean, if we wanted to work through lunch, we certainly could kind of talk about the permit there. We need a decision sometime in September, so it's not critically time sensitive, but I don't know. I was just thinking Rich might give us a sort of a overview of some of your concerns or some of the things that have kind of come up, persistently in the permit, so.
I just, Kent, did you think there might be anything to add for the Winooski Lampricide application? If he's there.
He's not
Yeah,
invited.
there he is. Yeah.
I believe we've commented everything we were gonna comment on, I think, so far. I mean.
Okay,
No is the answer, I guess.
great.
Those comments among all the documents? I didn't.
No, yeah, I mean,
We have our white paper.
right, yeah, exactly, yeah. Okay. Bob, all yours.
Had it and
I
I
know.
messed
yeah,
it up and now
Yeah.
I think it's back to it.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, we just, well, first of all, I know most of you, but not everyone, and I'm Bob Zano. I'm an ecologist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. The work I'm going to talk about is Vermont conservation design, which started in 2015, I think. And it's work that we've been doing since then. We just recently completed about a 2-year update that was based on, well, as you'll see when we get into it, update to the design, but still have fundamentally the same the same things with it. So I wanted to talk about what's in the design, what got updated with this most recent process, and then how I've seen this relating to individual species conservation and the link between the broad landscape features that are sort of the focus of this down to that very fine scale level. All right. This came out of the Fish and Wildlife Mission, the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats, which is something like 20 to 40,000 different species. I mean, you probably all know this, most of which we know nothing about, right? So we can't go through and protect them one by one. So the idea behind Vermont conservation design was to think about coarse filters, so larger features that we could identify on the landscape, that if we identified them and could conserve their ecological functions, we could meet the needs of many species without having to go one by one. And the example here is showing the forest block around Camel's Hump. If we conserve that, there's all sorts of species that are going to be in there, and we don't have to go find an inventory and know about every one of them. If we're maintaining intact forests, we're protecting those species. An added challenge to the coarse filter conservation, which has been around for, I don't know, decades, 40, 50 years. But the added challenge now is how we deal with climate change and the idea that the species are not going to be static in their distributions. Their distributions are going to shift over time, and we don't know where those species are going to end up. We know that species don't move as communities, they move individually, and that's what these maps are showing. The top sequence there is beech and hemlock following the retreat of continental glaciation. Beech and hemlock were growing in totally separate places 12,000 years ago, and they've converged on their current range. And we have to expect that patterns like that, species we think of as occurring together, may not occur together in the future. It's going to be wacky and wild and new. So that background brought us to Vermont conservation design, which we're calling a science-based vision to sustain fish, wildlife, everything, all the habitats behind that. And Vermont conservation design identifies the lands and waters most important for maintaining ecological function. And it's a stacking of different identified features. Features that are big at the landscape scale, like forest blocks and riparian areas, finer scale features like habitats and natural communities, all adding up to what we call the ecologically functional landscape. That ecologically functional landscape is, in 3 words, intact, connected, and diverse. It's intact. It has things like intact forest blocks, but also all of the species that naturally occur here. It's connected, so those species and processes can occur across the entire landscape. And it's diverse. It represents the range of physical settings and geologies, topography, aspect. All of that is part of this overall ecologically functional landscape. The pieces that stack up are at 3 scales. The first being the landscape scale. Then, like I said, natural communities and habitats. And then it's stacked in the sense that we can overlay like natural heritage data with our maps. But I think the species are more than just overlaying like the polygons from the heritage database. It's really thinking about how species interact with the larger features. So I want to talk about the landscape scale features, and the foundation of that is forest blocks or habitat blocks. These areas of contiguous forest and other natural cover bounded by roads, development, and agriculture. These were originally mapped in, I think, 2011. Eric Sorensen did that work. And that's the mapping you see here. And this is what we've updated. You can see that these blobs, I think that's the Mount Philo block in Charlotte there in the middle of the screen. You can see that they're really pixelated. They're blocky and coarse. And we used high resolution LiDAR data, which was 3,600 times more resolution than this to map forest blocks that now look like this. And it really helps identify the edge of these intact units, but it also really shows, and let's see if I can cursor going. It really shows places where there are, the lag is painful for me trying to move my mouse. Places like this, where you can really pick up fine scale connections between these forest blocks. And these connections, particularly in a place like the Champlain Valley, are going to be really key for species movement and long-term climate adaptation as things are shifting around the landscape.
Can I ask a quick question?
Please do. Yeah.
What was it about the LiDAR that gave this finer resolution? I mean, what is that picking up that you were seeing?
Essentially individual trees. So it's mapping vegetation height at a 0.5 meter resolution. And they being the UVM Spatial Analysis Lab, took that vegetation height, classed it into different land cover types. And we then use that land cover to assemble the habitat blocks. So using forests, wetlands, shrublands, probably missing something. I should mention Ali was on the core team for this work. Maybe you can help me remember if I'm forgetting something.
Yeah, you got long grass and shrubland.
Okay.
So the LiDAR uses like sub-meter accuracy, aerial photography. What was used for the previous version was generally 30-meter pixels. So we went from 30-meter photos to something small, putting together billions of sub-meter photos to build the picture of Vermont. That's why it's so much more accurate.
This is basically picking up individual trees.
Cool.
I mean, it looks like you buffered houses,
Yeah.
right?
We
So
did,
Yeah.
And I think that's really nice from an intuitive perspective. It really shows how structures are fragmenting the forest and giving that Swiss cheese character to places. Because the resolution on those two products was so different, we really can't make comparisons between the 2011 data and 2023. There's the numbers. I think they're essentially the same. There's small changes, and I think that all just comes down to the resolution, not to any actual changes we're picking up about forest in Vermont. So much better resolution, fundamentally the same assessment of habitat blocks, and not possible to make meaningful comparisons between the two data sets. Which is too bad, because that was one of our goals with forest blocks, was to track that over time. Maybe with LiDAR, we can get to something more consistent. Next, it'll probably be 0.25 meter resolution, and it'll throw the whole thing out the window
Or
again.
you have to deliberately revert to lower
Revert to lower.
resolution.
Yeah, we talked about that and decided that was not a worthwhile use of time. Okay, so we used, to make Vermont conservation design, we took that overall set of 4,000 some habitat blocks and prioritized them. First, we prioritized based on size and core area, so area away from edge. Came up with a set of highest priority and priority interior forest blocks. And for each of these features, I won't show this for everyone, but we have guidelines for maintaining the functions. So the idea here is that we don't need to go and buy and protect every forest block, but we need to maintain the functions of it, which can be done through land conservation. It can be done through use value appraisal. It can be done through just good stewardship by private landowners. And it's broad guidelines to maintain these places. That house is an example of what would be inconsistent with maintaining interior forest. Those big forest blocks, and they were stratified across all of the biophysical regions. So big in the Champlain Valley is very different than big in the Northeast Kingdom. But those don't all form a connected network. And so we also identified a set of highest priority connectivity blocks that does build that connection across the state to all the biophysical region, all the regions, and that supports that regional connectivity from the Adirondacks to the Gaspé, from Massachusetts to the Sutton Mountains, really recognizing Vermont's regional importance for ecological connectivity. This again is just showing how we could refine that connectivity mapping with this new data. Just examples of where we can pick up connections that we would never have seen before. And that was really useful. We could identify specific road crossings. And really identify places where there's over the road connectivity or where improved structures under the road could facilitate connectivity. The third habitat block component is this one, geological diversity blocks. And this is, I think, just the coolest part of Vermont conservation design. It is a set of blocks that, working in tandem with all the other landscape features, represents the full range of physical settings in Vermont. So we know that species are really tied to specific geology. Many species are tied to specific geologies or specific aspects, climate, micro niches on the landscape. And so this was an effort to represent all of those in the design. And that dark purple area really is the highest priority because those areas collectively have all those settings in a relatively small portion of the state. And then when you consider them in the context of the larger connected network, it really provides resilience and the ability for something like a species that needs a wet calcareous bedrock at a certain temperature to be able to maybe move to wherever that appropriate setting is going to be in the new climate modeling. Kind of mangled that sentence, but I hope it made sense.
Is that,
Wait, can you take questions now?
Yeah.
What, Matt, you were gonna.
I was just getting clarified. Is that the same? I don't remember that name in the previous versions of what you called physical landscape diversity.
Yes, we
It's the
renamed
same procedure, just with the new.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't there, it just seems there'd be more higher priorities in the Champlain lowlands for some reason.
They're all, I think almost everything in the Champlain Valley is dark in that map. It's just hard to see.
Oh, but what about the white?
The white is just areas that are not natural cover. They're either developed or ag.
How does that speak to that? Or, you know, the fact that, you know, like, for example, in the Champlain Valley where you have specific soils that are all ag, but they really do, could represent, you know, unique, you know, microcosms or micro ecosystems. You know, this is just sort of like not paying attention to that in a way, right?
We primarily focused on what we have for forest blocks, but I think when we think about the connectivity and the long-term function, this can be used to think about, well, where is restoration going to have the most benefit for connecting forest blocks?
Right, wouldn't those areas though, like even have a different color or something because they're, I'm thinking like clay plain forests, for example, you know, they're just so isolated that I guess with the new technology, it gets picked up, but there's no connectivity and it would be a priority because there's so little of it, right?
Right,
Yeah, I agree.
that's a great point.
so is they're assuming, or maybe you actually know this, that like there are actually still remnants of, you know, every physical landscape diversity flavor out there. There's nothing that's been completely converted.
Not using the data that we used. So we used one that had 459 combinations. And then we used the land type associations, which are a little coarser. And there are certainly settings like sand plain and clay plain where they're much reduced from what we would have had prior to all the land change, but nothing is totally missing.
So what about like high quality grass? I mean, with grasslands, you know, for
Well,
example.
hold that thought. We'll come back to grasslands.
Grasslands is always the.
Yeah.
It's a hard one.
Well, that's related. Your term was just forest blocks. And was that specifically forest blocks as opposed to wetlands, natural wetlands?
We say forest blocks or habitat blocks interchangeably because in most cases, forest is the dominant cover, but no, they can include shrub wetlands, you know, an open fen or a peatland, but not like anthropogenic lands like farmland.
So these are kind of naturally vegetated blocks.
Yeah. But that would be hard to say every time.
Yeah, but they're in there.
Or even under in there, yeah.
What's that?
Yeah.
Sure. Are included.
There's the pretty geological diversity pictures. And Kent's photo of the West Virginia white butterfly, which is I think a neat example of the tie to geology. It's a plant that, it's a butterfly that depends on toothwort. Toothwort needs rich woods, real link between a rare species and that geology. To go faster through this. Surface waters and riparian areas. All surface waters and riparian areas, broadly defined, are highest priority in Vermont conservation design because they're connected and they're just all important. We can still prioritize within that network for specific work, but they're all critical.
What are the red priority ones then?
Yeah.
All.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
You still have
misspoke.
a two-tiered.
We do have a two-tier. So areas in the riparian area that are developed. So not ag. Ag is part of the highest priority, but developed lands like parking lots are priority. Sorry, it's such a small percentage. I forget to say that. Thank you. We also use the LiDAR vegetation data to map natural cover in the riparian zones and refine that mapping. And that's really key because there's places, I mean, like the Champlain Valley, there's Snake Mountain, Buck Mountain, Dead Creek on the left and going out to Bristol on the right, where those brown naturally vegetated riparian areas are the connections. Like, that's the only way species can move across the landscape between these otherwise isolated habitat blocks. Those features of the landscape scale, just by conserving those, maintaining their functions, we could probably have confidence we've protected many, many species. But now we'll layer in this next stage, habitats and natural communities, that adds confidence that we're getting all the habitats needed or all the settings needed. Natural communities is an important one, the 97 different types. I think you can picture how each of these 97 natural communities, here's 4 examples, has its own suite of species and processes. It gets us many, meeting the needs of many species by maintaining these places, and that each of those places is going to support a different set of species into the future, but different from all the other ones too. The top of Camel Sump is always going to have different species than a river cobble shore. So it helps at that climate resilience. We have targets for young and old forests, shrublands, and grasslands. And these are different than the other pieces of VCD because these are, we don't know where these are on the landscape. We don't have good mapping of them. And in some cases, we know, like with old forest and young forest, and probably with grasslands, we don't have enough functional area of each of these on the landscape. And it's going to take restoration to bring these conditions back. So here we identify broad areas and then have numerical targets and show you for young and old forests. These are based, the young forest is based on historical disturbance regimes. Old forest is based on a professional judgment target. And then grasslands, we had this, what we called when we were working on it, a lifeboat acreage of, if we could have 7,500 acres managed specifically for grassland birds, that would be an area that seemed reasonable to supporting the at least most of the populations of grassland birds. Alan, if you reviewed that.
I don't think so.
Not necessarily contiguous.
Not contiguous, but I think we have
The
minimum-
smallest need to be.
I have that slide. I do, yeah.
How
At
big
least
is it?
25 acres and ideally 250. This shows how, as you get down in scale, the management guidelines become more specific compared to forest blocks, where it's like, you know, just maintain the forest.
So a 250 acre plot that was 20 miles away from the nearest grassland would still be sufficient size. based on.
I would say for 250 acres, definitely. That's gonna suck some birds in, no matter how isolated, I think.
Yep.
But anyway, just if you, just kind of, if you're interested, I mean, right now, there's, I mean, the bobbling project is enrolling about 1,200 acres a year, 800 or 900 are in Vermont. We don't have any that are over 200. I mean, the highest, we've got a couple that are about 100 or 120 acres are the biggest that are enrolled in the project. So it's, compared to what's in the bobbling project, it's, it's definitely, it's, ambitious, I guess. Yeah.
In that mowing guideline, is that just sort of an example? Are there finer sort of civ guidelines that might be related to other taxa, other than birds? Where that mowing guideline might be inconsistent with conservation of other taxa?
Yes, we have a technical report that goes into more detail about these guidelines. I forget the extent to which we talked about other species, because the focus here was primarily on meeting the needs of grassland birds. So not sure.
Okay, but there might be invertebrates in the mix.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of an aside, but I'm just thinking about like a project in Heinsberg that's under permit, under review. And there was some issues about grassland bird species. And it, just, it was clearly not an issue because it was a really small isolated patch, but it still came up as something. And then you have people that sort of latch on to this as like, oh, we got to protect the grassland birds and therefore we can't do this development. And it's like, it's just happens, but anyway, I don't know where I'm going with all that, but
We're so Ava-centric.
I know, well, birding is the most popular thing to do in. Isn't it?
What's that?
Bird watching is the most popular thing to do in the world.
Second only to herping.
Gardening is number one. Yeah. Anyway. Sorry to interrupt.
I'm not going to talk about all the other features at the natural community habitat scale, but that gives you a sense of the flavor. The last piece is species. And I've been thinking about this in terms of species that have their conservation needs largely met in Vermont by the coarse filter features. So if you take all those things that we just talked about, the suite of features in Vermont conservation design, if we had all those, like if we could restore the old forest, if we could meet that grassland target, then what species would likely have their needs met without us having to go in and deal with them one by one? Not that we never go monitor or anything, but that we just don't need to be in there hands-on. And the pale painted cup that grows only at Smuggler's Notch is like an example of one of those species. Very rare, but if we're maintaining that habitat, that's kind of the best we can do. Spiny softshell turtle is like the total opposite end of the spectrum. That really needs hands-on. It needs those fences and keeping people from wandering in the nests and those pesky raccoons. Fine filter species that we can do all of Vermont conservation design, and probably we're always going to have to work hands-on with spiny softshell. Actually, I want to shift out of the PowerPoint for a moment here and show. Yeah, trying to reshare. Bear with me a moment. Eric Sorensen and I've worked with some of the SAGs starting a few years ago, I guess before COVID, to take that approach, think about what species have their needs met by the features of VCD and which don't. And to try to put that all into a giant spreadsheet that you probably can't read anything of, but it's got I'll zoom in, you can see it's got across the top is different parts of Vermont conservation design. Down the left is different species. And it was an attempt to say like, well, what parts of VCD help support different species? And when you look at that across the row in total, what's our confidence that this species is, does VCD sort of check all the boxes, or is it like the spiny softshell and it's going to always need some individual attention? And this has been, I think, a really neat analysis. The bird SAG dug into it for a while, and then COVID hit. The herb SAG has done a fair bit of work on it that has been really awesome. And I don't know if this is helpful or not. It's, I think, partly about testing the design and like, did we get the right pieces in VCD? But I wonder if there's also a way that this can help with thinking about species conservation and the scale at which we approach the needs of different species, and where do we find those efficiencies and where not, or where is it just never going to be efficient to get that species conserved?
Are you using like SGCNs or like, how do you choose the species?
Yeah, this was a mix of some common species, and we didn't find a common species that didn't have its needs met by VCD, and at least the haphazard selections we made. And then we looked at SGCN to see how those shook out, and that was closer to like a 50-50 breakdown in some of the initial work. And it quickly devolves into like very complex questions about, well, what would this mean? And I think there's like a fast pass you could do at it, or a very, very detailed pass. And I don't know if one makes more sense than the other.
Sure, I guess I was gonna say on the confidence assessment, like, when you showed the plant that's just on top of Camel's Hump, you're 100% confident because that's the only place that species is.
Right.
But I'm wondering, like, what happens when you've got, half of the species distribution in Vermont covered by, through ecologically functional landscapes. I mean, is that like a 1 star in terms of confidence, or because you've got half, you're fully confident?
I think we got with some of those, Bob Pop and I worked on plants some, and he agonized over a lot of the choices. And I think some of it came down to, well, if it's so rare that we only know of a handful of places, and some of them are along roads or something, and they're not inherently captured by these features, then that was a reason to make it fine filtered.
Yeah.
I don't know if we approached everything totally consistently, the way that different taxa groups thought about this.
Mm-hmm.
But it does seem like just being very rare makes it tough.
Yeah, but it's so great to see this, but like a Venn diagram of all this mapping that we've been doing for the last, 20 some species mapping. Like we're just all these animals and plants that we're like finding where they are in the state, like it seems like that would be so useful for that very discussion.
And this is what we would like to do, is to take the Vermont Atlas of Life and overlay it with the VCD maps. And we're hoping to get some grant money to do that, and
that would be great.
Figure out how to counteract the bias that everyone sees things along roads.
Yeah.
But I think this will be really awesome if we can look at where all these observations are relative to these features.
Those two data sets have not met yet, like the VAL data and VCD.
That's what our funding proposal
Okay.
aims to do, is
Okay.
to assess biodiversity and then also select species just as a first pass at sort of testing it all out and seeing how they match up or not.
That is really cool.
Yeah, and Val will be able to do not just current distribution, but projected future distributions modeled. And so we can also compare some of those to the area in VCD and see if it actually reflects that potential future range.
Are you hoping to do that in all the different taxonomic groups? So that would be an activity that you do with SAGs?
Well, so for this proposal, we would just sort of lay the foundation of how to do this with just a handful of species. 'Cause it's very
It's kind of a
data intensive and So there's a lot of work just to establish the modeling. But then could go from there.
And I asked that question, Bob, because before you got here, you shut me down.
No, I didn't.
It's easier when you're online. I can just mute you.
I understand the need.
No, he asked a question relevant to this discussion.
Yeah,
So I said, wait,
and
wait,
it's just
hold on.
that, it would seem to be useful to generate really the important herb areas, the important, lichen areas, the important whatever, that we know of, and, create a layer for you to use. And I would say really that you would be the ones creating the layer. We would be providing the data or well, we could certainly provide the data, but also provide recommendations, the information. But it seems like a useful, because so many of the herbs that I'm thinking of are the fine filter creatures. And some of them are, for example, where do you see that's within their range? Of course, that range is going to change in the future, but where you also have overwintering habitat, feeding habitat, and breeding habitat that they can get, then where they can move between all three, right? And so that seems like kind of another layer of mapping that would be useful, another layer for you.
Yeah, that would be, we struggled thinking about that when we were coming up with the initial features, like, even something like bear, where you want to show the relation between spring feeding wetlands and mass stands and denning habitat. And we couldn't really get our hands around that. And so I think the hope is that by just doing forest blocks, a good chunk of those, that we are getting many of those places, but I think you're right, it's the specific ones that then become fine filter, and like the crossing in Moncton, that's a fine filter.
Yeah.
Thinking about.
And then putting it up there and saying, okay, this is covered or it is not covered.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm not sure I'm gonna anticipate what Jed's gonna say, but I will just say that, Jed has got a, graduate student now who is doing a lot of work on connectivity and some pretty sophisticated analyses. So go ahead, Jed.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Bob, this is great work. I mean, it's really, really fantastic. This is not a comment about connectivity, but I think that's important. And we have worked quite a bit with Jens on part of that project, so he's aware of those connectivity products. But I would say that we have, on the mammal side, invested in building some species distribution models for about 10 different species, bear, moose, deer, all the way down to skunk, in terms of size. So we have like contemporary maps of distribution in Vermont, but important to what you were just saying about looking towards the future, we've plotted those against different scenarios under climate change and landscape development. So if you're interested in exploring how what you've developed here like relates to some of the mammals, those might be good products to use. So happy to provide those or point you in the right direction on those. And I did just have another question before I turn off here too, about the use of this for, what is it, Act 59, the Biodiversity Act. Like, is there a plan to maybe use this as a planning tool? I haven't read the act in some time. In terms of making decisions about how to meet those 2030, 50 targets, 2050 targets. Thanks.
Yeah, and that would be awesome to take that mammal data and overlay it, particularly the future distributions. That'd be really cool to do. So
yes, yeah. Happy to send those.
For Act 59, and maybe I'll look to Roz or John to jump in, but Vermont conservation design is specifically called out in the act as some of the guiding science that should inform the conservation plan. So I'm sure hoping and anticipating that it'll be a big part of that in the we're on the inventory phase of conserved lands now, and the planning phase is the 2 years starting in July, I think. So that's when I hope this will get incorporated in.
And that, on the, I mean, I don't need to speak for Kent. I mean, I'm sure he often says, I mean, on the right there, that's like 9 million records or something on the right, I believe, of all tax, right? Like, I don't know, there's so much potential here. It's amazing.
Yeah, we're really excited to work with BCE on that,
Yeah.
get that underway.
Have you done that overlay just with, with the heritage data set to see it just for the rare species, like what proportion of all of the EOs, for example, just has a really crude cut at it are captured within the design, highest priority or priority.
We did, I think it's something like 80%. That would,
Yeah, so
that on a
like
slide
right there,
there.
that's a huge chunk of the pie.
Yeah,
And obviously it doesn't capture the kind of complexity that Jim's talking about where, maybe we've mapped the breeding habitat, but don't have the upland habitat.
When you run that by the data geeks like Kent, they go, oh yeah, we can do that. Right,
As the machine starts smoking.
must mean we're wrapping up. That was in there. I guess maybe a few concluding thoughts. Vermont conservation design, we're really emphasizing that this is maintaining nature and its benefits. It's that intact, connected, diverse landscape that gives us species and natural communities and lets nature adapt. But that while we didn't do it for these other reasons, it really is much more than just sustaining biological diversity. It's all these other things that we would get out of maintaining that ecologically functional landscape. And these things are all consistent with maintaining that ecologically functional landscape. I think that convergence has been part of why this has been so successful. Here's just a few ways that we've been using Vermont conservation design in our work at Fish and Wildlife. We're hoping that it'll be central to the Wildlife Action Plan, and particularly that 3-scale structure it's already part of the action plan, but we can really make it that much more of the way that the action plan revision is structured. John's really working hard on that. And I guess just to end that it's a vision, and it's about all the conservation tools, and particularly the way that we intersect with private landowners. It's not an a la carte menu. All these things are important. It's forest blocks, young and old forest, it's grasslands, riparian areas. We need them all, even though an individual organization may focus on one particular aspect. And that I think it really brings together lots and lots of conservation work in a way that's not prescriptive, doesn't tell people how to do things, but it shows how it all fits into a larger whole. And there's a lot of people and organizations who have been part of this that we really appreciate.
In addition to that, in addition to the 30 by 30, 50 by 50, could you touch on how Vermont conservation design is integrated formally or maybe informally into the RPC and town planning?
That is Jens's world. I'm actually not sure that I could speak comprehensively about that.
Okay.
Maybe.
Well, other than to say it's incorporated, and I think that's sort of become the fundamental aspect of what Jens Hilka delivers now in his work with communities and regional planning commissions. So that's sort of the starting point. And then depending on the interests and the needs of the communities, he builds up or down from there. But that's become
it is sort of the backbone.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yep.
I was going to say, we did something in South Burlington. It was, I guess it was probably just before the pandemic, where they wanted an open space plan. And I mean, this was obviously old BioFinder, but we used that as a way to help rank parcels that would be important for conservation in South Burlington. So certainly gets used. And I think a lot of it depends on where towns are in terms of their planning process. If they've got an update of a comp plan or something that they've got to do, that it can come into play there.
Bob, do you have an idea, or John? If other states have moved in the same direction, have come up with anything comparable, our neighbors, or well, I mean, we looked at on a regional scale, just in terms of stuff moving across boundaries, but also how much the political will is in the other states to move in this direction, and provinces.
There's there's big scale work, right? Like the Nature Conservancy's Resilient and Connected Network, and there's very good overlap between that and Vermont conservation design. So that's one way to quickly scale this up to a regional network. There's work in other states. There's Biomap in Massachusetts. I've heard that Maine is undertaking a conservation planning effort that may be similar to this, with their beginning with habitat program. I'm not aware of anything that is quite as comprehensive as Vermont conservation design. And I think we're going to conferences, and even next week at the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, to really say, like, we've got this thing that we think you should do and we should all do together. It'd be awesome if we had a regional Vermont regional conservation design.
There are a few other states that have or built in as part of their action plans. But I think where Vermont, I don't think it's the only one, but where it really stands out is that built into the stuff, Bob didn't get into it that much, but there are targets for each of those habitat types or land cover types by biophysical region. Setting targets is something that scares the hell out of most states. We've got that in there, and we've also got the support from Act 59 saying, thou shalt build this, which really, in other states, they're attacked for talking about big scale conservation. So it's concept out there. It's not alone, but it's a pretty cool special thing.
It's an important question that you raised, Jim, and it's a conversation that's been ongoing around the region, the New England states and the Eastern Canadian provinces for almost 10 years now. That is, where is everybody at in modeling and assessing their ecologically functional landscape? Whether you do it the way we did it or you do it a different way, we've been encouraging all of our partners to do something. Ideally, we do it in a consistent fashion so that there's synergy and you can sort of compare and contrast and make some meaningful decisions if people take a similar approach. And we're continuing to advocate that. We had the New England Governor's Eastern Canadian Premier's resolution signed in 2016 that was encouraging all the states and provinces in the region to, try to understand the current state of affairs with respect to the ecologically connected and functional landscape of the region. And then based on that understanding, develop plans around transportation and land use planning and land use regulation and land conservation and land management. How are you going to, within those sectors, ensure that the integrity of the landscape throughout the region is maintained or restored or enhanced? And that had a lot of traction up until COVID, at which point the train came off the tracks. And we're making an effort now to get it back on the tracks. In fact, there's a summit planned in Montreal, Quebec in June to bring back together again all of the states and provinces that were the original part of that conversation. And part of that conversation in June will be revisiting the state of the science. So we have the ones that Bob mentioned, TNC's Resilient Connected Lands Network. There's Nature's Network from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There's other sources of information. So sort of hitting the reset button with leadership, regional leadership. It won't be the governors and premiers, but it'll be the Julie Moores and the Joe Flynn's of the world in the region. And hopefully get them to make some sort of a renewed commitment to working together throughout the region to keep moving the needle on this. Bob is going to present next week at the Northeast Fish and Wildlife Conference to all of the Fish and Wildlife administrators. And part of the pitch is, if you think that Vermont conservation design is a good approach, we would encourage you to use a similar approach if you're going to develop a map, so that there's the opportunity to do things, to make decisions and to inform one another and to share information with some measure of consistency. Because ours was built off of the approach that TNC used by and large, just at a different scale with some finer level detailed information. If we were to rely on that, the TNC's region-wide model, and then people had similar approaches for developing a state or provincial map, I think there could be some real opportunities, some real strength in that kind of science to be guiding sort of. I mean, each jurisdiction has to make decisions based on their economies and their politics and all sorts of different factors. But the opportunity with the summit and the opportunity we had years ago with the resolution is trying to create a shared vision amongst the states and provinces around the region to at least be heading in the same general direction for landscape scale conservation and still respecting the independence and the unique issues and challenges of each jurisdiction.
As much as I push to show the potential loopholes and improve the fine scale piece of the project, on the broad scale, I think you guys ought to be particularly proud and of the insight that you have shown and the leadership that we as a state can show with a program like this. I think it's something really, it's amazing that we had the political will to start this and keep it going. I think we should be really proud of that. And often I think Vermont sets an example and say, yeah, you can do this. It can work. And the sky won't fall. The sky may still fall at it. While you're moving in that direction. So,
Remember, Bob, we brought Bob in for optimism.
yeah.
Airport plan.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Gotta make sure it gets in there.
Yeah. Okay, we should probably take a break. Bob, thanks so much. Really, really great. And you are sort of moving out to the SAGs and continuing conversations there, or would that, I mean,
Yeah,
is that a pitch to make here?
I'm happy to keep working with the SAGs on that analysis.
Mhm.
I think we're also thinking about how with the action plan
Yeah.
to build an not to displace the species part, but how to sort of use that fine filter, coarse filter link to inform how we think about species in the action plan. So that could be another avenue of discussion with the action plan groups and the SAGs.
Yeah. No, I think, one of the things that we've talked about, and I just feel like we haven't really kind of come together on this, is, sort of cross taxa conservation priorities, because we've sort of, we've kind of dispersed, and we've got the birds and we've got the plants and we've got the invertebrates, and we haven't really been thinking about where those synergies are. And I think this could be really helpful for that.
And it's what we're trying to do with the swap is to
Yeah,
focus more
right.
on those synergies and the habitat cross-pollinating.
The community,
landscape
yeah,
and
the
the
communities
community
have been the most helpful there. Yeah.
And this is something the national increasing focus on. We can't do one species at a time. We have to start somehow grouping things
Mhm.
more and connecting things more and conserving at a different scale or
Mhm.
with a different view.
Yeah.
And as challenging and time consuming as I think it would be to try to figure out where all the breeding pools and overwintering habitat and feeding habitat all come together, I think you have most of that data in the element occurrences
Mhm.
I mean, if the populations are there and they're continuing, then they are reaching what they need to reach to survive. And so with those element occurrence data, I think you can get at how well you're meeting the needs of the fine filter species.
I wonder if it would be worth sharing, because you did do that analysis of looking at how it compared with elemental occurrences, and I imagine those could be broken out taxonomically and shared with the SAGs, or is that easier said than done?
I'm not sure actually, because TMC did that analysis for us. So I'd have to look back at what the raw data is. And has that communication. So I can look into that and find out. It'd be easy enough to redo it though.
Yeah.
It seems like, especially for those of us that have a lot of species as opposed to
Yeah.
forbs. Some way, if you can say, this whole chunk of species are captured, just we'll ignore them and figure they're good and focus on reviewing a smaller set. That would be helpful.
We can just add that in as a attribute in the heritage database. Is it in VCD or not?
Right. Check.
Well, thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
thanks, Bob. Well, what's the, yeah. What's the pleasure of the committee here? We're about 20 minutes behind schedule. The only agenda item official agenda item was to talk about the Lamproside application on the Winooski River, but there was some time to talk about potential new business. I had one item I wouldn't mind putting on there. What's your schedule like, Brian? When you?
Well, I can stick around. I really do need to duck out around now, but I mean, we're not going to vote on it. We're not.
We are not
on it.
voting on it. Yeah. Yeah.
I wouldn't do anything based on me. If our folks want to go sit, have lunch and can reconvene, that's,
We're not gonna do anything based on you, don't worry about it.
Well, I mean, I don't know how many people have lunch or people need to get lunch, but we could have a working lunch and talk about
I can stick around. I'll try and stick around as long as I can. Yeah.
okay. Well, why don't we do that? If folks need to go grab lunch somewhere, maybe go and bring it back here if that's possible, and we can, that work? Can you get takeout?
I don't know, can we?
Well, there's a cafeteria.
Well, that's what I meant. Yeah, right.
It's like,
Yeah.
I have to